letting those individuals in. If you could kindly mute yourself, please, if you're not talking. All right. We want to go ahead and get started here. We know you probably have a lot of questions for us, and we have a lot of information to share with you. Just start out that this session will be recorded. We also will have a live transcript going so that afterwards we can post the recording along with the slides and then also use that transcript for any of our note-taking purposes. Welcome to this March monthly webinar, and happy St. Patrick's Day, and thank you for engaging with us on this topic, which is critical updates and assessment, and also gearing up for spring activities. As you know, the pandemic has caused uncertainty in all areas of education, including assessment, and things are changing at a very rapid pace. The purpose of this webinar is to share some of the evolving expectations over the course of this school year for these ESSA provisions and to highlight what we know today and what we still don't know. We appreciate your partnership as we tackle these difficulties together, and we also recognize the tremendous planning, preparation, and training overall efforts that all of the folks on the call have taken so far this school year to support assessments. And just so you are aware that our office will continue to seek flexibilities and to support you at the local level. So just a few housekeeping items before we get too far along here. Given the size of the attendance on the call and the virtual nature of this meeting, it may be difficult for us to kind of pause for all moments to have questions answered. So we're going to really use the technology to the best degree we can to gather your comments, questions, and ideas. If you could please mute your microphone when it's not in use. Of course, during our section breaks, you can come off mute and ask questions. You are welcome to share your video, and in fact, we encourage that. We use that for nonverbal cues to help us present and also for us to connect with you guys, but I understand if bandwidth is a problem or for other reasons, distractions, whatnot, you can adjust as you need to. Please make sure your name is clearly visible in the participant panel with your first and last name and your district information. And in the spirit of time and just verbal questions, as I mentioned, given the size of our audience, we will break between each of our presenters today and give you an opportunity to ask questions. But also, again, that chat is a great way to send us as we go along so we can field those in real time and also address those at appropriate times.
Jelly beans too. I'm lending jelly beans.
If you could kindly mute yourself, we would greatly appreciate it if you're not asking a question. And so in total, what we have for you today are 35 slides for each of us to share a little bit about each of the programs. So just as a session disclaimer for today, our information that we have to share with you is current as of today. It stems from the laws, regulation, and the OPI's policies for assessment, accountability, and reporting. As of today, the OPI has not received a decision from the U.S. Department of Education on its February 5th waiver application for the assessment, accountability, and reporting provisions under ESSA. Just as another note, Montana is not removing the option of state assessments this spring and is seeking maximum flexibilities within the law. This spring, the #1 priority of the OPI is the safety, health, and well-being of school staff and students. When it is safe to administer assessments, this webinar is really focused and tailored to provide you with suggestions and to support with these spring activities. So as we give you a little bit of a tour of our section objectives here, we would love to know who is in the audience and where you're joining us from. So from that participant panel, if you would click on that, please, here. And what you can do is just hover over that More section and rename, and then it gives you the opportunity to do that. And just as I'm doing right here, if you could let us know your first and your last name, and also if you have a school district, the school district information or other affiliation, what that is, just so we have a little bit of sense of who is in the audience. And as I provide that overview, you can continue to do that. So we're going to cover some critical updates in assessment, and that focuses on those ESSA provisions, so assessment, accountability, and reporting. That includes the status of our waiver. That includes activities with shortened blueprint, extended test windows, medical exemption policies, all of those things that we've kind of been sharing throughout the school year as that information was coming to you and to us. Talk a little bit about assessment setup and preparation so that you have the tools to be successful this spring with those spring activities. Some ideas for local monitoring strategies for assessment, or if you've been selected for those site visits, some information for you. Key dates and reminders, so important information as far as timelines, and an open forum for questions. Oops, sorry about that. So looking here at the U.S. Department of Education, or department, I'm going to call it throughout the rest of the session today. On February 22nd, they notified the Office of Public Instruction as well as all states with this information, which offered flexibility regarding accountability in school identification and also transparency in reporting for the school year 20 to 21, so this school year. At a very high level, it described those options for flexibility for states. It emphasized no blanket waivers for assessments. It talks about what waivers were in place for accountability and school identification. And it maintained that reporting requirements, including disaggregation of data by student subgroups. So here is a little bit of a tour of dates that we've had in the last month and a half or so. So on February 5th, the Office of Public Instruction, or OPI, submitted its waiver application for assessment, accountability, and reporting to the department. And with that waiver application, it sought full relief from those ESSA provisions. On March 4th, the OPI met with U.S. Department of Education representatives to emphasize the need for school districts to have full flexibility this spring. And we're also in process right now and hopeful to have another follow-up conversation with them later this week to continue that dialogue regarding Montana's unique schooling conditions and circumstances. As part of our conversation, we really focused on safety, health, well-being of staff and students, and also that need for flexibility. So what I'm going to do is put some information for you in the chat here in reference to these items that I'm sharing. And so on March 5th, the OPI released a press release to schools to share some of these federal updates and these conversations we were having with our federal partners. In that memo, it explained some of the spring options that the OPI was seeking with our federal partners. So it proposed some spring things that we had discussed with the department, and it also mentioned, as far as testing plans this spring, that safety is the #1 priority. And just kind of talking through where we're at in that conversation as a response to that February 22nd memo, just wanted to go through at a very high level some of those sections of the memo. It's essentially categorized into 4 buckets, one being that accountability, school identification, the other being transparency and reporting, state assessments and the flexibilities proposed by the department, and public comments. So starting with that accountability and school identification section, the department invited states to submit an optional waiver for accountability and school identification. This is not required, it's optional, and using that optional template that was released on March 8th. I want to point out this highlighted section here. So what's important there is this element, I think, really relates right now to spring activities, because what it's looking at is that 95% participation rule. So within the accountability section, under the academic achievement indicator requirement, essentially this waiver, if states seek it with the department using that template, would remove that 95% participation overall and also with subgroups. So we're still in conversations with the department to understand whether or not our February 5th waiver application would suffice, or if additional documentation or information, including the submission of the optional template that was released on March 8th, is required in order for us to grant that flexibility of the 95% participation rule to our schools. So now I just want to kind of go over to this transparency and reporting section here. So if the February 22nd waiver was granted to Montana, it does not eliminate any of the state or local report card requirements. So it essentially requires states who submit this waiver to still publicly report information. So what's, I think, important in this section is states pursuing this still must ensure transparency to parents and the public, including the reporting of percentage of students not assessed and also disaggregated by those student subgroups. Again, for those of you who are just joining us on the call, we are recording this webinar, and we will make these slides, the transcript information, and also the recording available at a later date. The transcript we'll use for note-taking purposes, so when we pause between presenters for questions for you to come off mute, we'll be able to capture those in real time. And also, if you have questions as I'm presenting, I know I'm throwing a lot of information out at you pretty quickly, please submit those in the chat, and we're going to field those in real time. So my colleagues on the call will stop me if it's appropriate during my section, or I'll come to that at the conclusion of my critical update section. So I'll keep moving on here. So we're on the second component of that February 22nd memo. Now I'm going to transition into the heart for assessment. You know, we really are in this land, in this area, so we wanted to take an opportunity to kind of dissect this a little further on where we're at, what we know today, and what our actions have been so far. So in the state assessment section, really an emphasis on that February 22nd memo to focus on assessments that provide information to parents, educators, and the public on student performance to help target resources and supports. Again, a key component that was cited in that memo was that the department was not allowing blanket waivers from states. Included in that section of the memo were some suggested flexibilities that the department introduced to states to consider for this spring. So I wanted to just emphasize what those were and then kind of say where we're at with those. So one thing mentioned was administering a shortened version of statewide assessments. Another thing, offering remote administration where feasible, extending test windows where practicable, even more extensions for English language proficiency assessments like our Access for Ls or WIDA test. And what I want to share with you is that in our deliberations over the course of this school year, what we've done purposely is balance those reporting obligations with our test window extension decisions. So the first thing to kind of point out are three actions, if you will, or takeaway from those flexibilities that were cited in the memo. Was first that extension of all test windows for all spring assessments. So this is Smarter Balance, this is science, this is the alternate science, this is the alternate math and ELA assessment, this is ACT. So for all of our content area assessments that are being delivered this spring, they have all had their test windows extended in some fashion. And I'll share a little bit more about that at the end of today's webinar. And again, a balance with reporting was taken as we made those decisions and deliberations. Second thing we've done is we've shortened the Smarter Balance assessment on average by 1 to 2 hours and really focusing on prioritizing standards and instruction to support student learning amidst abbreviated daily schedules and variable instruction models. And what I'll do is just segue to this later. Dwayne's going to explain a little bit more in depth than I just covered here in the tour of what we've done to respond to the memo. The third thing that I wanted to just kind of dispel is that information about remote proctoring or remote administration. So the OPI determined it was not practical this school year to allow state assessments to be delivered to students remotely or at home administrations. And this is due to a variety of reasons. So for example, does the child have a quiet space free from distractions to engage with the assessment? Or does the child have a parent at home to help them with questions without assisting them on the assessment? And given the significant needs in order to enable these technologies with remote proctoring, we foresaw a lot of concerns ahead of our schools. And so due to quality of internet access, types of devices, individual differences, with students in their environment, these highly variable conditions, we determined it was not practical for Montana schools to turn on these technologies this year, that there needed to be more time for this technology to be operationalized and scalable before that would be the right choice for Montana. So that is not allowed, although that February 22nd memo suggested it to states. So in Montana, we have not gone that route. And the last element here of that memo that we wanted to take an opportunity to discuss is public comment. So with our February 5th waiver application, what we did was a 40-day public comment, a pretty rigorous public comment, if I might add. And so we want to, in conversation with the department, determine whether or not that period of public comment, since it's the same as the provisions, would satisfy this need for the Section 8401 process and the optional templates that they released to states on March 8th. So again, we're in conversations with them, we're fielding questions, presenting questions so that they can understand Montana's unique circumstances and conditions. We're also trying to continue to seek those flexibilities and options for our schools. But again, we need to have this decision first on that February 5th waiver application before we can determine what next steps are necessary for schools this spring. So with that, just a highlight here, this shows those flexibilities we've already secured in those yellow highlights, if you will, throughout here. In our discussions with the department, we really emphasize that Montana's system of local control and governance in place. We emphasize having full flexibilities to choose what's right under uncertain times this spring. And to respond to what was included within that March 5th memo that was released to schools, we also wanted to share with you that we are considering a state option for Lexile and quantile measures by Metametrics. This would essentially add reporting options for the Smarter Balance summative report and also the interim comprehensive assessment so that we could have comparability between those Metametric measures and other local tools such as assessment interims or even literacy needs to support families and educators. For instance, with those tools enabled with the Smarter Summative, essentially a parent would know what Lexile level a student was essentially at from that administration and be able to, at a local library or something, be able to align those measures when seeking resources for their child. So safety first. So regardless of the waiver outcome, the OPI will continue to support Montana schools with spring testing plans. We will not remove the option for you to administer statewide assessments within any of these test windows. So they will stay turned on throughout the period that they are currently published. For statewide assessments, we've also released this guidance document, this 21 COVID-19 state standardized testing guidance, which provides recommendations on how to administer assessments safely. We will continue to release the monthly newsletter for assessment for schools to support them with spring testing plans. This resource has a lot of information and supports in it, as well as assessment updates. And so what I'm going to do here is copy those resources into the chat. So if you're not subscribed to that bulletin, I highly recommend it. We do our best each month. It's really tailored to help with those test coordination responsibilities, but we include information on every program within that resource each month. And last but not least, for my section on critical updates here on February 19th, notice that 19th predates that February 22nd memo, we released our medical exemption COVID reason policy. So any instances where it's unsafe for a child to participate in state assessment due to COVID reasons can be reported to the OPI using this policy. This is necessary for that Access for ELS assessment. It was not included within our waiver decisions. It was not included within this February 22nd activities to respond to that department with that optional template. What we are doing right now within our office is trying to determine the necessity of this policy for the spring assessments. So if the OPI submits the waiver using that optional template that was released on March 8th, essentially what it does is it removes under that academic achievement indicator that 95% participation rule in subgroups. So it may not be necessary then for schools to submit on to the MONCAS application this medical exemption for COVID reasons. So we're still in conversations about the process and our activities for next steps on submitting to the current waiver that the department has offered or not. So again, back to that point I just made, first we need a decision from the department on our original February 5th waiver application before we can determine whether or not we need to submit for the waiver that was offered under the February 22nd rules. So the next section here, my colleague Dwayne Schleby is going to present some information for you on Smarter Balance Assessment, as well as the multi-state alternate assessment, so our math and ELA programs. And he's going to talk a little bit about setup and preparation information to support you, make sure you're ready if those are in place for your spring testing plans, and also give you some frequently asked questions. So for those of you who were not on the call with us on March 1st, we received a lot of questions from our system test coordinators in our open forum that we've kind of categorized, and also it's an incoming, we've had a high volume of calls and emails, and we've taken a lot of those questions too, chunked them out so that we could share with you in real time some frequently asked questions for each of our sections. So turning it over to you, Dwayne.
Thank you, Ashley, and happy St. Patrick's Day out there to all of my fellow wearers of green. Cheers, right? And if you look here, you've got the Smarter Balance test completions. I just want to be clear when we refer to Smarter Balance, what we are talking about is math and ELA state summative assessments. So this has been updated this morning, which means this is the completion rate as of end of day yesterday. Blue bar, if you look at it, represents number of tests started. Red bar represents number of tests completed and submitted. Then you see them broken out into grade levels there as well for you. Kind of gives you a broad overview of where we sit at percentage-wise, maybe 1% completion at this point, 1.5%. So this next slide is going to address something Ashley has already alluded to, and that is adjustments to the math and ELA assessments. Many of you are already aware that blueprint for the math and ELA, i.e. Smarter Balance assessments, have been implemented this year. They will remain so going forward. It's not a one-time thing. This blueprint removes the ELA performance task, PT, replaces it with brief rights. Now keep in mind those brief rights, they are embedded in the ELA CAT per the adjusted blueprint. So note that there is no longer an ELA PT test session available. I've actually been getting quite a few calls about, hey, there is no ELA PT session I can access. And that is correct. That has been removed in lieu of the adjustment. So then you also look at the adjusted blueprint average total test taking times, include this math CAT, math PT, and then you would have your ELA CAT. It's going to take between 3 and 3.5 hours on average with this new blueprint. Note the previous full form blueprint average testing times, approximately 5 hours. And if you want details on more about these blueprint, adjusted blueprint, average testing times, I'm going to send you a link here in chat. And what it is a recording from our ASSIST conference titled 5 Things You Must Know About Smarter Balance This Year. Take a peek at that. And then I am going to break the next few slides, next 4 slides into big ticket items. If you're sitting there and going, okay, just give me the big ticket items, what do I have to do in preparation for math, ELA, Smarter Balance this year? This next slide is the first one is going to address student test settings. And what we're talking about with these student test settings is make sure you complete them in preparation for that testing in math and ELA. Make sure that students have their accommodations, designated supports, universal tools turned on appropriately and tied before you start testing per IDEA requirements. And some of you have probably heard of student test settings being rolled over from last year. So let me explain what happened. Because of the coronavirus challenges brought on by 2 school districts this last year, the OPI rolled over all student supports and accommodations as they were set and tied last year into this year. What this means is any student settings the district created for a student last year, that would have been the spring of 2020, before the waivers hit the first week of summative assessment windows for Smarter. These settings are essentially rolled over into TWIDE for 2021. Districts should not assume that a student's accommodations or supports are already set for them, but need to make sure that student settings correctly reflect individual kiddos' needs. And I just want to mention there's no such thing as accommodation support being automatically set for a student in TIDE via an AIML upload. When students are uploaded into TIDE, the only thing we can see is whether they have an IEP. It's a yes or no, nothing more. What this means is the accommodations option are available to students that have a yes, but if they're not selected or turned on at the local district level, the student is not going to have any accommodations. So when I refer to a rollover from last year's test settings, what I'm really saying is that whatever the test settings were for that student last year, which had to be done on the local level, is mirrored in this year's TIDE portal. So it's a bit of content there. I will move to the next one. Next big ticket item for preparation for Math ELA, the portal, is test administrator preparation. Making sure that all your test administrators are trained, prepared to administer the assessment the day you're going to administer the assessment. So in the Montana testing portal, some of you may refer to it as TIDE, all test administrators need to complete that 20-minute test certification course, and they need to sign the online test security agreement. Make sure those tasks are done before any testing begins. Otherwise, your test administrators aren't able to access any test-related materials or administer the test. Another reason for this is there's a 15-minute delay between the time a virtual test security agreement is signed and the platform provides testing permissions to the users. So doing it prior to the day of testing alleviates any anxiety. Then the third item that I will talk about is on this next slide is going to be ensuring that updating secure browsers, all students have an updated secure browser on their portal before starting. Without an updated secure browser, students are not going to be able to log in, participate in the assessments at all. Check any of your student computers, have your IT person review the technology and supported browser documents, as you see up there located in that screenshot on the top with the red arrow where it's located. One of the other things I always say, if you're a system test coordinator, not an IT person, great way to check it. Open a student computer with a secure browser. And if your box shows up, a login box shows up, that means you do have a new browser. Otherwise, it will tell you it's an unsupported browser. And then the final big ticket item that I'm going to talk about today is making sure reviewing to review the test administrator manual, often referred to as the TAM, located in that Montana test portal. And I'm going to drop this link here in the chat for you while it is on the portal for all of you guys to access at any point in time. Make sure you have it available during the testing window for any questions you may have, and also prior to testing, review it, be familiar with it. And I'm now going to switch more from, I'm going to stay in Math and ELA. I'm going to switch to the MSAA, which is the alternate, multi-state alternate assessment. Testing window opened up Monday of this week, and it's going to remain open through May 14th. That May 14th date represents a 2-week extension to the testing window. And the next slide is going to address the big ticket item around this, most of the calls I've had surrounding the MSAA, which this is a visual representation of how students get into the MSAA portal. As you plan to administer the MSAA and review the portal, remember, do not add students to the portal from the local level. Every Friday, we conduct a weekly upload to the MSAA portal and reflects any changes in the AIM state database. If students are missing in the portal or misidentified, make sure they are properly identified as qualifying for an alternate assessment in that local student data input system. In other words, it's either going to be Infinite Campus or PowerSchool for your district. And the process and how students are identified to be placed in the MSAA portal, obviously you can see it up here. If you have any more questions around this misidentification, feel free to reach out to us. We'll walk you through the process. And that is all I have. And I'm going to turn the slides back over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. So what I want to give an opportunity right now is anybody who had questions for Dwayne on math and ELA, or for me with the critical updates. I kind of glazed over that quickly. We'll give you just an opportunity right now to come off mute and ask those questions, or again, you can submit those in chat. All right, I'm not hearing anybody come off of chat here to pose any questions to us, so I'm going to turn the ball over to Chris, who is going to share with you some assessment setup and preparation for the science assessment and some also frequently asked questions.
Thank you, Ashley. First, I'm going to start with just some great news. Today is only day 3 of our science window being open. On day 1 of 55 possible testing days this year, 10 districts started testing, 367 students started a test, 91 students finished it, and 1 district completed their science testing on day 1. Day 2, we kind of increased that number, and we've actually gotten to the point by the end of the day yesterday that we had 4 districts completely done with testing. I'm sure you can all guess whether those are big or small districts that were able to complete all of their science testing in a day or 2. But we do have 778 students done with their testing, which is almost 4%, 3.5% of our entire student population eligible for the science test this year. And so we know that we are moving and we are going with the science test. The test is working. We look forward to seeing more and more districts kind of joining into those numbers as we get further into the window. Ashley, if you want to go to the next slide. I didn't put together a whole lot of setup information. And the reason for that is that I want to minimize confusion at all costs. And I want to just let Dwayne's setup for SBAC sit as the record of how to set up your assessments when you're working with one of the assessments that comes through that TIDE portal for our student settings, and that comes through that secure student browser for the student to do the assessment. Our science test this year is delivered within the exact same browser as the Smarter Balanced assessment is delivered. All of your setup, all of your preparations can be done now in tandem between science, math, and ELA. We did have a stagger of 1 week between the start of the windows this year, but now that we're up and running with both assessments, any work that you're doing to get yourself set up for science, you are doing for math and ELA and vice versa, with the exception of building out those individual rosters for your science assessment would be just at your tested grades for science. We do have a waiver that is unique to science this year. It allows us to do a field test. We were supposed to have done a field test last year, and we weren't able to do that because of COVID. And we advocated to the department that it was very important to us that we do an independent field test this year. This allows us to maximize the number of items that we get into our operational pool. This is really, really important because as we move forward, we want to have the strongest science test possible. And whenever we kind of are starting off with a new test, one of the biggest barriers that we have is a robust item pool. And so on the end of the continuum where we're thinking about test design, this field test is an incredibly important step of in order to make sure that we have that robust set of items going forward. We believe that the waiver that allowing us to do a field test also benefits schools because it allows us a little bit more space to make that transition to new science standards. It gives everybody exposure to the increased rigor items and kind of the breadth and method of testing across those standards. So we're really looking forward to everybody having that opportunity this year. Thank you to that waiver from the federal government on our accountability and reporting. And I get 4 questions, just 4. All the time it's the same 4 questions. So we're going to look at those 4 questions. Hopefully everybody here knows the answers to them, but I'll share them anyway. We're ready? Question number 1, are we giving the science test this year? Yes, we're giving the science test. My favorite is when people ask if we're giving SBAC science. I'm going to take the opportunity to just remind everyone that Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium is what SBAC stands for. The science test is not affiliated with that Smarter Balanced Consortium, and so we have named it the Montana Science Assessment, or MSA, and so that is the assessment that will be administered. The next question is, will there be scores? Not formally, because they're field test items. We can't do traditional reporting. That's part of the reason why we have a reporting waiver from the federal government. That said, we are doing our best internally to provide some reporting back to districts so that you're able to use this as an opportunity to evaluate your science instruction, your curriculum, and to prepare yourself for next year when that assessment will be operational. Our next two questions. Thank you, Ashley. Are we still testing grades 4 and 8? No, we are testing grades 5 and 8. That transition actually came along with the standards adoption. The standards are chunked into elementary standards and then middle school standards, making it far more appropriate to assess at grade 5 than it was to assess at grade 4. This will be the first year that we are assessing 5th graders instead of 4th graders because of that delay last year. But indeed, this year we will assess grades 5 and 8 on the MSA. 11th grade students will take the ACT for their science test. And then the last question is, why haven't I gotten my CRT science print materials yet? Probably by now you know the answer to that is because it is a computer-based assessment. In the event that you have a student that needed print materials, that is something similar to Smarter. You can order a printed version. You do need to contact us ASAP though, if you need that for an individual student so that we can make sure to get that process moving. And that's the end of my slides. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.
Thank you, Chris. So right now, if anybody has any questions for Chris, please come off mute. And we also have a flurry of questions that are coming through in the chat here that we're doing our best to keep up on answers. So if you feel like you need more clarification or information from any of the questions you've submitted in the chat, another great way to just come off mute here and get your questions answered.
So Kira, yes. So actually, and the example that I like to share with people is that when we did our back-end testing, we actually did it all together across all of math and science and ELA because they exist within TIDE in the same way. They exist within that, that administrator portal where the TA administers the test. They exist there together. And then again, they exist in that student browser together. In all three spaces that you would have been engaging with the Smarter Balance assessment, whether you're as an STC setting to student settings, as an administrator launching an assessment, or as a student taking it, you will now engage with the science test in the same place.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so turning it over to you, Marcy, for you to share with folks the ACT setup and preparation information and also frequently asked questions that are coming in for ACT. If you are talking, you are on mute.
Yes, I am on mute. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And our first ACT test date's coming up next Tuesday, window number 1, March 23rd for the paper testing, and then the online 23rd, 24th, 25th, and then also the Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of the following week. So that's pretty exciting. Did want to make sure that everyone is aware that there is an ACT COVID emergency test date available. Our 2021 test dates are flexible to allow districts and schools to use paper, pencil, online, or a combination of both modes. And schools can use all 3 published dates as needed to ensure all students are given the opportunity to get the ACT taken. The OPI has partnered with the Office of the Commissioner of Higher Education, OCHI, to request more flexibility for the spring administration due to the pandemic, and have been successful in securing that COVID emergency test date. That will be for schools who may need the opportunity to enable testing of grade 11 students for reasons related to the pandemic. That date will occur in early May. It will only be offered in paper pencil mode. There won't be an online mode for that. And then I would just caution you not to think of that date as an additional date. Its intent is for it to be used in an emergency related to the pandemic. If schools use that date, it will push our reporting back to a later date. So just don't think of that as an extra date, but as an emergency. Just going to go over a few setup and preparation tips for the ACT. For online testing, if you are doing any online testing, you do need to change the delivery format in PA Next for each student that will be testing online. That can be done right up to the day before testing. With that said, you also need to ensure that you've taken all the steps to ensure your school can conduct the online mode of testing. I'm going to put a link in the chat for the ACT technical guide for online testing. It has step-by-step instructions for setting up your school, your devices for online testing. So if all of those steps are not completed, you will not be able to use that online mode. So it's not only changing the delivery format, it's those two pieces together. But again, you can change that delivery format right up until the day before testing. Ensure also for paper and online testing, be sure to distribute the non-test instructions for students. And I'm going to touch on that on the next slide, Ashley, in the frequently asked questions. So for frequently asked questions, we get a lot of questions about the online and paper options. So again, you can use both of those in combination. So you can have a group of students test on paper and a group of students test online. You can use all 3 dates. So if you needed to meet some spacing protocols or procedures for your school and needed to split your junior class into 3 groups, you could use the online or the paper testing for window 1 for one group, window 2 for a second group, window 3 for a third group. So you can use all 3 of those dates, however it works best for your situation. For the online test, if you use a later date, there's nothing you need to do as far as alerting ACT or ordering materials, changing the date. That's going to automatically be available as long as you have those steps to ensure the online testing is able to be done on your devices. So there's nothing you need to do as far as notifying anyone if you're going to use a later date for online. With the paper testing, as in the past, you must order materials for a later date. So you cannot use March 23rd materials on April 6th. You cannot use April 6th materials on April 20. So just keep in mind that if you're paper testing, you do need to go into PA Next to order paper materials for those later dates. And there is a specific order window that you have to do that ordering, and it's on the schedule of events. I'll pull that up here in a little bit and put that in the chat for you as well. A link to that schedule of events. My ACT account, that's the other big ticket, I guess I would say big ticket item that we get a lot of questions on. And one of those questions is, where are my student codes? I can't find them. You will receive a pre-printed student non-test instruction sheet for each of your students in your ACT materials. If you have a student without a pre-printed sheet, there's a form to submit to ACT to receive a code for that. You can find the instructions online, and I'll share that link for you in the chat. So give you instructions to receive a student code. Students who were in PA Next at the time of upload should have that student code, but if for some reason you run into a situation where you don't have one, you can request one. And those pre-printed sheets will have that student code on them to create that My ACT account. The other question is, do we have to do the My ACT accounts in class? Schools may elect to provide class time for students to create those My ACT accounts, or you can send that student non-test instruction sheet home with your students. They can create that account at home. They could create it with their parents around to help answer questions. So those can be done either way. Students have up to 2 days after testing to create those accounts. So they do not, the next question there, are they required? They are not required to test or to receive grades, but they do have up until 2 days after testing to do that. If they want to have scores sent to colleges, it is required for them to create the My ACT account. And OPI does recommend that those accounts be created. I would also add there that if students think they might take the ACT again, maybe as a senior, if they have that My ACT account created now, they'll have both scores available in that account when they take it again. And the last big ticket, I guess, is the non-test questions. You're going to receive 5 state use questions on the answer document. That's going to be part of your administration manual. That is part of testing. So when your students are bubbling in their demographic information, they'll bubble in their demographic information and then answer those 5 state use questions, and that's on the answer document. The remaining non-test questions will be answered within the My ACT account. Any questions before we move into monitoring?
So I would like to just give the audience, so we're on slide 25 here, and we've got about 14 minutes left here. So I want to pause to see if there are questions specifically for Marcy on this section or anything above, just being really respectful of everybody's time. The next section of the content that we have prepared is on strategies for local monitoring, and also really specifically for schools have been selected for local monitoring. And so if you have burning questions at this point in time on any of the program stuff, I guess I would encourage you to ask those questions now in case you're not able to stay with us if we go over 4:30.
Susan, students who have moved grade levels, students who are in AIM Infinite Campus in the AIM system as grade 11 students are the students who will be taking the ACT. If they have moved grade levels at semester time, you can do an unenroll. If they're no longer 11th grader, you would do the unenroll process in ACT. Or if you have someone who moved up into grade 11 from grade 10 at semester time, you would do the enroll process in ACT. You can use extra materials to test that student. If for some reason you don't have enough materials, extra materials, the deadline to order was last Friday, so you would likely need to use test window 2 to make up for that student unless you're doing online.
Thank you, Marcy.
You bet. Pre-ACT dates are not the same as ACT dates. I will, while Chantel is talking here in a little bit, Jeff, I will pull up the link to the schedule of events, and that will show those pre-ACT dates, but they are different than the ACT dates.
I'll take this one.
Okay.
So there's a question in the chat on medical exemptions, and I just wanted to clarify for everybody with the medical exemptions. So that policy, there is the medical exemption option for a medical reason and also the COVID reason. So that policy was released on February 19th. It is really important that we have that information for COVID reason or medical reason for the Access for ELS or WIDA assessment, because that really predated the information that we received from the U.S. Department of Education on February 22nd. Our office is still in conversation right now on what that policy means into the future. So just to kind of clarify for everybody on the call, so non-participation reasons are really important when you know the overall participation status, right? So the only test that has completed at this point in time is the Access for ELS or WIDA assessment. So you know with certainty those students could not participate and did not participate in the assessment. So to answer the question in the chat, yes, for the Access for ELS WIDA assessment, for any number of students you have individually, you would use that system directly to enter that information and explain the reasons so that we can make an evaluation and return it to you. And if you have 10 or more students, then you would use that system. And what you'll end up doing is there's actually a separate process where you e-pass 10 or more students to us through that secure file transfer system, so you don't have to manually enter them within the MontCast application. So again, the only test that has completed the test window, so we know with certainty participation, statuses for those kiddos, is the Access for ELS. Now, forward thinking, I would caution you guys right now that you don't really want to be entering non-participation reasons because none of these test windows have expired. So there's still an opportunity. So in our deliberation, in our conversation process, that's something we would ask. So did they have the opportunity for any point without the entire test window to participate in the assessments? And you don't know that today. And also it's possible, given that new information we received from the U.S. Department of Education, that potentially that policy would not be valid anymore because we submit a waiver to get the 95% participation overall and subgroup rule removed from schools. So there's just a little bit of clarification and more information for you on that policy, non-participation in general, on what that means, and the MONCAS application. As far as documentation is really a district decision. We've provided guidance within our policy on some sample forms that you can use to kind of have consultation with parents and medical professionals, depending on what the situation is. But there is no requirement on what documentation looks like. We do have the opportunity to ask you, let's say 3 years from now, did you have enough evidence locally to make that determination? That is within our policy or our process with the OPI, but we do not have any standard as far as what that documentation or level of documentation looks like for districts. We see that within that local system of control as a district decision for you guys to make that determination and a decision internally. Are there questions? You can come off mute or you can continue to submit them in the chat before we segue into our local monitoring section. So we have another chat in here on looking at, did the child have the opportunity, and as far as letting them know, bringing their kids due to safety concerns. So consultation, if you've provided that, so parents are aware that they had the opportunity, that would be considered as consultation, and you've done your due diligence and your explanation to inform us and inform parents, then that level of justification as far as entering in the explanation in our system is something that, we reserve the right on a case-by-case basis to determine this. So I don't want to say, yes, it would be granted, but yes, those are things we look for when we make an approval decision. So those would be covering your bases most likely, but we would need to see it on an individual basis. All right, I'm going to turn the slide here for you, Marcy and Chantel, so we get into that local monitoring section for you to share some strategies and what we know at this point in time on some of these other areas within the MONCAS application.
Thanks, Ashley. So just quickly, before we get into your local monitoring, just as most of you are likely aware, the OPI does perform desktop monitoring of our required data collections. One of those data collections for the assessment unit is the assurance of test security agreements having been signed by the staff involved in testing before testing happens. So test security agreement completion is assured by STCs in the Secure User MONCAS application. And in addition to the test security agreements, the STC also assures that testing plans are in place for the district. And again, those plans should be in place before testing. So as of this morning, 44 STCs have not yet completed the test security agreement within the MONCAS application. That's 16% of our STCs. Our test windows, for the most part, are open. So that's a bit concerning. And next slide, Ashley. And 53 STCs have not yet completed the required records tracking screen. So that means 19% of STCs have not indicated that all of their staff involved in testing have signed test security agreements, or that they have not completed testing plans. They don't have those testing plans in place for their districts. So those are required test security activities, and the non-completion of them does pose a concern for those districts. So if you have not done that yet as an STC, you're going to want to get that completed right away, as it should be done prior to testing. So another required monitoring activity are the OPI site visits to targeted randomly selected schools. The OPI assessment unit observes one or more test administrations at the selected schools of the state assessments. This year, due to COVID and the resulting OPI travel ban, and acknowledging that our visiting schools may affect student safety, the OPI will not be performing these site visits this year, but we have initiated a process to have selected schools do a self-monitoring activity to meet that requirement. Many of you have already been contacted about this activity if you are a selected school, and we do want you to know we're aware of the challenges this year has already presented, so we want to express our appreciation to those of you who have been selected and are working with us to complete those local monitoring activities. They're important activities for the OPI and for schools to have assurance of the quality and integrity of this year's assessments. There is an example here on this slide of the Access for L's local monitoring checklist on the slide. This is an observer checklist, and we have modified these checklists slightly for these self-monitoring activities this year to meet those OPI site visit requirements, since the observer will be someone local rather than someone from the OPI. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So in addition to the test security monitoring being conducted by the OPI, your districts and schools should also be conducting that local monitoring, even if you're not a selected school. So this slide points out some of the things that your school should be paying attention to before, during, and after testing as part of a local monitoring program to ensure proper test security. And I did say I would talk about those observer checklists again on this slide. We encourage your schools to use those checklists to perform your own monitoring activities. I'm going to give you a link to where you can find those checklists on our website. So using those checklists is a great way to ensure your schools are following proper test security measures, and those results that you'll be getting in the fall are valid and reliable. You'll find those at that link in the resources section. So there's a table on that, on the page that I just shared in there in the chat table towards the bottom of the page, and you'll find these checklists in the resources column. So a couple things to be paying attention to as you're planning your local monitoring. Before testing, in addition to the bullet points here, you're also going to want to monitor those test settings in the assessment portals to ensure that those are correct. Dwayne talked about those a little bit earlier. During testing, you want to keep a pulse on the testing progress in your schools. All of our portals can assist you in monitoring test progression. And then after testing, be sure to have a debrief with your testing staff. Talk about how did testing go? What went well? What didn't go well? Think about ways to adjust your testing plans to ensure any hiccups you encountered this year can be avoided next year. Use that debrief time and the information you gain from that debrief time to update your plans for next year. I'm going to turn this over to Chantel to share a great resource to assist you with test security practices.
Thanks, Marcy.
Thank you, Marcy. So before we transition over to Chantel, there is a question on the chat related to your section there for submitting testing plans. And just, I think, to explain a little bit in the MOPCAS application, so when you do the required records tracking section, if you're a system test coordinator, there's an area for you to have a checkbox to indicate that you have these testing plans in place. That is different than another process. So these are also included as part of the title Common Compliance Monitoring, where we actually do have as an evidence example you to submit your plans. And so although you don't have to upload them into our system, that is one way in which we do review plans with districts if your district is selected for title monitoring. So if you have other questions about that, feel free to send them in the chat. And also, before we transition to Chantel, if there are any questions you want to come off mute, I'll give you a pause here to see if you have questions. All right, Chantel, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Ashley. So I'm going to talk to you about our training resources. On the OPI site, there is a link to the MOPCAS Test Security Portal. So Ashley or Marcy has already put the test security page link in there. From there, on the right side of the screen, there is the MOPCAS Test Security Portal, and I'm going to put the direct link in the chat. So within that portal, there are materials available to acclimate a new STC or to allow an STC to facilitate a training for TAs, their test administrators, to become familiar with test security. The completed video series will have 5 parts. As of right now, we have 4 parts completed. To learn more about the importance of monitoring and your role, as well as examples of desk and site monitoring, you need to visit part 4. Within each one of those sections, there is a purpose, a YouTube video link, the PowerPoint presentation. So as Marcy mentioned of local site observation, regardless of the spring school selections, schools should continually conduct their own site observations yearly. Back to you, Ashley.
Have a good evening.
Thank you, Chantel. I think we had a little bit of delay with the information you shared with audio quality, but that's okay. I think you came through. And before we transition here to the key dates and information for reminders, does anybody have any questions for Chantel on that resource for test security? All right, Jacob, off to you.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to let everyone know that WIDA has released or announced dates for the release of Access for L score reports. So before they had sort of told us about a month later than usual, and now it's looking like it's going to be just about exactly a month later than usual because of extended and delayed test windows across the consortium. So you will be able to access the WIDA score reports online as of May 24th at this point, and they should be delivered in printed version to your districts around June 2nd. As we get closer to that time too, I will put together some materials to walk STCs through accessing those score reports and looking at the data sort of from a bird's eye view. But for now, just mark these dates on your calendar.
Thank you very much, Jacob. All right, and I'm just going to share this in the chat again as far as sharing with you those test window extensions that we described earlier. So as a reminder, or those of you who are just joining us and didn't get this earlier in the session, as suggested by the U.S. Department of Education within that February 22nd memo, we did extend all of the test windows to the greatest extent practicable for this spring. And so in the chat, you can actually get access to this window of published tests that we have on the screen here. And just as a reminder, so the Math and ELA alternate assessment, also known as the multi-state alternate, was extended 2 weeks. There is a COVID emergency date for ACT, but as Marcy mentioned, that should not be used in instances to plan for testing. It is truly designed for emergency given the reporting delays that it would cause when enacted for a state. And then also looking at the Smarter Balance, so our general math and ELA assessment, and also our science and our alternate science, those test windows have been extended all the way till May 28th. So the red highlights on here show you all the test window extensions we've done. And again, a balance with reporting obligations included in there with those decisions. So this is a slide for you. Again, we will make the webinar recording available. We will make the information as far as having that transcript enabled in the Q&A that we've had within the chat with you here today. We'll do our best to make sure those frequently asked questions from today are posted with this. And then also these slides will be made available shortly after today's recording is done as well. So this will allow you to direct link into all of those resources. And now is your opportunity, really open forum. What we shared with you today, you still have questions that we may not have covered. Any questions, clarifications, or comments you have, we're happy to answer those at this time.
I have a chat directly to me that I'll just go ahead and answer to the group in case anyone else has a question about it. Heard that OPI will pay for pre-ACT for 10th grade and who to forward the invoice to. If you did order pre-ACT materials, because yes, they are free for grade 10 students for Montana high schools. If you ordered and were struggling with that, please send me an email, my email address here for you, and I will find out how we are going to be managing those invoices. You should have had a state contract option pop up for you, but I do know that a lot of people were having some difficulty with that piece in the platform that you order pre-ACT materials. So if you did get a if you did end up ordering and ended up with an invoice, will you please send me an email and let me know, and I will let you know how to handle that.
Thank you, Marcy. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time and your efforts to ensure learning continues during these trying times, and also your partnership as we navigate these uncertain times together. We will stay on till the last person's here to answer any questions that you may not have felt comfortable coming off mute. Thank you, everybody. Have a great St. Patrick's Day.